This is Dan Bolen, and I'm the host of the podcast, The Courage to be Courageous, where people come from all over the world to share their stories of courage to overcome the fear and use courage to get through that fear. There's some incredible stories that we've been able to do in the past few months, and we'll be able to hear some encouraging stories in the future. First of all, I want to thank all my podcasters for your excellent comments on my email and to me personally about my book, The Courage to be Courageous. And I wanted to also let my audience know that it can be purchased at Barnes & Noble here in Scottsdale, which is on the 101 and Shea Avenue. If you want a personally signed copy by me, I personally signed them, and you can pick them up at Barnes & Noble. And, of course, you can also pick them up on Amazon.com as well. So thank you all for your feedback. I have a very special guest today that I want to introduce all of my podcast listeners to. As you know, the Trevor Project is one of the organizations that I support very strongly. They're a part of my beneficiary and also part of the proceeds of my book, The Courage to be Courageous, goes to support them, along with two other organizations that are under the LGBTQ network. So I'd like to introduce you. This is going to be special because we're going to talk to a volunteer youth crisis counselor for the Trevor Project. His name is Dennis, and I would excited to have you find out a little of the inner workings about the Trevor Project. Just to introduce some of you, as you may know or not know, they actually are a crisis hotline for teens that usually in the ages, I'm guessing, between 13 and 25, somewhere in that area, who are having issues with coming out as authentically as themselves, and it's a suicide hotline. And Dennis has done such a great job in being able to help those that have dealt with suicide. And we're going to find out a little bit about the process, how he operates with them. And you can actually contact them both verbally. They can be contacted by phone or digitally, which I didn't know. And Dennis is going to tell us a little bit about that. So, Dennis, welcome to my program. It's such a gift to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be with you as well.
Okay, very good. Now, Dennis, he's obviously extremely well educated. He has a bachelor's degree. He has 2 master's degrees, and he has a PhD in public health from UCLA. So obviously, he's extremely well educated. And kind of, why are you so extremely educated, Dennis?
Well, it was sort of the alternative to getting a job, I guess, and just going back to school. No, seriously, I made my first career in an area of rehabilitation, but more sort of physical rehabilitation, and then went back to school for another graduate degree in health services management, and then got recruited by the faculty to be part of their first PhD class graduating from the School of Public Health at UCLA. So previous to that, there was only the ability to have the professional degree, the Doctor of Public Health, but what they call the terminal academic degree, the PhD. So, and it was almost terminal, I'll tell you that.
Well, and do you think that getting so much education in your case was because you were, tell us a little about your history and how you knew that you were attracted to men and how that all started?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking, Dan. My history really began in my teens, and I knew back then, and I'm a little bit older than, significantly older than the youth that I have the privilege of addressing through the Trevor Project. But this was back in the 60s, and it was when being homosexual was considered to be a crime and considered to be a psychiatric disorder. And it was a point where there were no allies available. I mean, nobody you could talk to about your feelings or your emotions or what was happening to you on a day-to-day basis. And, where one felt like one was being an outcast. And what was the sense of living if you were going to be an outcast in the world? And what I found was we always look within Trevor about a safety plan, de-escalation, trying to understand what will enable those individuals to take a break from some of their scariest thoughts and to pursue some other areas. And I found that education was that for me. And so a lot of what occurred, because even through college, it was difficult for me to admit that I was gay, even though it was after Stonewall, and to be able to come out to others. So still hiding in the closet, and my hiding really took the form of just digging down and doing my work and doing all these degrees, and plus the fact I did work in between. So I did work in a rehabilitation unit at an acute care hospital, and dealt with patients on a regular basis. And so that was part of also giving back, and sort of the gift of helping others recover after a stroke or recover after an accident. But education, and it's still that way in a bit. I mean, I'm not in the closet anymore, clearly, but I still have a lifelong desire for learning.
Excellent. Now, during that time that you were using education, and of course, education is good, but it's like any good thing, we can get addicted to something. You can be an education addict. I'm not saying you are, but it sounds like you use that to bury who you were. Would that be a fair statement?
That's a very fair statement, Dan. And it was the one thing where my coping mechanism was active and allowed me to sort of put my energy into doing really well in classes and in a therapeutic environment. And so that was very important to me, and it was my safe place, if you will.
Yes, I got that. Now, during that times, obviously, I'm sure you had shame during that time, that you were ashamed that you were a gay person, coming from society or coming from the way you were raised. Didn't you mention to me you made a couple attempts at suicide?
When I was younger, in my teens, mm-hmm. That's correct. Mm-hmm. And so I had significant suicidal ideation, did try an attempt at taking my own life, and actually more than one attempt at taking my own life. And, it was interesting because even at that point in time, after the event happened, I was required to see a psychiatrist. Mm-hmm. And in the time of seeing the psychiatrist, I never dealt with the underlying issue, which was being gay. And so even though I was in my teens, I went through the therapy sessions, but never admitted what was the source and the underlying cause of my mental health.
And your distress. Yeah.
Yes, and the distress and being scared, and being different from all others, and not sort of fulfilling what was, quote unquote, at that point in time expected of me as an individual. That I would date women, that I would find a wife, that I would have children, and fit into sort of the normal pathway that, or the pathway, I wouldn't call it normal, but the pathway that society expects from an individual.
So when was the time, Dennis, that you came to deal with who you were and be able to accept it and to move forward? Because, and I've said this before on my podcast, when you have fear and you don't embrace the fear but deny the fear gets stronger and usually end up addicting on something. When was that point in your life where you finally began to accept who you were and process that. Can you give me some insight on that?
Yeah, and thanks for the question, Dan. I appreciate it. It's a little bit of a difficult statement for me to put together because it was an evolution. It wasn't a moment in time.
Right.
And so when I moved to Los Angeles, there was a community here that I felt a lot more comfortable with. But within the university and then within the work situation, I still tried to maintain a different life. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I became clear in terms of who I was and my dating and going out and having fun. But within sort of the rest of the work school environment, I just tried to maintain myself as a non-gay person and to present myself as any other person who was there. And so that was probably in my 20s and my 30s, and probably didn't deal with the comfort level of expressing who I am until probably my 50s or 60s. And that's just not too long ago, because I had the realization, I had the knowledge, I had friends I could talk to about it. I had allies at that point in time, but I didn't express myself to others as a gay man.
Mm-hmm. So it is a process. I totally agree with that. But was there any primary event where you first told someone you were gay? Can you remember an event when that happened, or were you?
Oh, yeah, I can remember telling my mother that I was gay, and I could remember telling. I could remember telling, and I even know when this occurred. It was in 1979. My best friend, a woman who I adore, who I met on an airplane many, many, many years ago. And sitting down at a restaurant and telling her I was gay, and just waiting for what the reaction was. And so that was sort of the first time, aside from talking to my mother and father, but the first time that I really had the conversation with somebody from my heart.
How did your mother respond?
She was actually fine with it. She didn't respond negatively at all. And it was surprising. She was probably the most endearing, person in my life, and just a loving individual. So she was fine with it. My father sort of put it into a compartment and just kept it there. Okay. But my mother would say things, she was happy when I found people who I was dating, and she would get together with them. I would bring them to where they were living, or she would come out to California by herself, and we'd all go out to dinner. So she sort of understood what was going on and did not harbor any ill will. Because she just loved me. And, she was, if there was an ally when I got older, it was my mother.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Unconditional love.
That was fantastic, too, as well. Now, did you have other brothers and sisters?
I have a sister, and our relationship with me being gay has always had a little bit of tension around it until just recently. And I think she now understands sort of the trauma that I went through as a young person, and how that even impacted my relationship with her. A big piece of being sort of on the outs with her was as a result of her husband, who was not threatened by me, but couldn't envision what my world was like, because he's sort of a macho Italian guy, and they had a daughter, and their first daughter, he really didn't even want me to touch, because he was concerned that I was gay, and what would that do, and how. So it was, that came from a point of probably ignorance and lack of understanding. I do have to say he's done a 180 from that time to now, and and he's very free with giving me a hug and telling me that even though he didn't like me at the outset, he's really grown to love me over the years.
Oh, wow. Well, that's a gift that he gave you as well. Well,
Yeah.
Dennis, let's talk about a little bit about the project there at Trevor, which is such a great organization. How did you get connected to Trevor? How did you decide to become a voluntary clinic counselor? And tell us a little bit about the inner workings of Trevor and what got you connected to him.
Okay, well, for a number of years, I wanted to give back to young LGBTQ youth in a way that I didn't have the same opportunity, because I understood, what sort of the challenges were. And this was before it got even more intense with the current situation within Congress and various legislatures across the country. And I wanted to look at a way of giving back. So I actually contacted Trevor. Okay. I knew about the Trevor Project, and I did some outreach and contacted them. And after a while, they contacted me back. And they had changed I believe they had changed their venue from just being a hotline to also using a digital platform, which provides a lot more access to youth who really want to really have a need and are in moments of crisis to contact. So, I was interviewed. It was a Zoom interview by Trevor, and they give you a little test then. Then before anything happens, you have to submit to a background check. So, and at that point in time, you had to pay for your own background check, so did that. And then you get accepted into the training. And for me, the training took from the period, I think it was February until June, to complete both the online training and then the practicum of having been supervised. And then you have the ability to go on your own. We still have supervisors if we need help during a particular contact. But we still have supervisors. And so at that point in time in June, and that's 3 years ago, I began to have a weekly shift. And every week I have my shift. My shift was yesterday, and had some very intense contact with individual youth. It worked out okay for both of them, but sometimes that the underlying cause for the youth is not that they're gay, but how they're being treated by their family. So they're okay with themselves, but their environment is not one of being supportive, okay? Or they're being bullied at school, or they're being forced into a religious, one second, they're being forced into a religious situation that's contrary to their wants and desires. So, that's how I just wanted to give back to these youth. And for me, working on the digital platform is the best way to go. Number one is that, as you said earlier, this platform is mainly for youth from 13 to 24. So it is age banded, although during my last 3.5 years, I have had youth call in who were 11 and 12 and who were in a moment of crisis.
Wow.
And needed an ear, needed space to explain what was going on with them, and needed to have somebody who understood without judgment what they were feeling and what their emotions were and what their thinking was.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Now, your sessions that you normally do, Dennis, are 3-hour sessions?
Correct. Every shift is a 3-hour shift. And so, yesterday I had my 3-hour shift from 9:30 to 12:30. And I had 2 contacts within that 3-hour shift.
How many contacts did you say?
2.
2 contacts, okay. Because you're back and forth communicating with them digitally, so you need to give them the time right there because they're in a crisis. So you have to spend time with them.
And one of the key things about Trevor, which is excellent, is that there is a risk assessment protocol. So we understand where the individual sits in terms of their suicidal ideation, whether they're not suicidal, whether they're low risk, whether they're medium risk, whether they're high risk, or whether they're imminent risk. And the time you spend with a contact really depends upon their risk, depends upon the risk assessment.
Right.
So if somebody is high risk or imminent risk, you have no time limit. So if it goes past your 3 hours, you can continue on, or you can try to transfer to another counselor. So if it's a medium risk, there's a time limit, and if it's non-suicidal or low risk, then there's a time limit on the conversation. And the point of that is that there's typically a queue of individuals reaching out through Trevor, and we want to make certain that you get through to those individuals and they don't have to wait in queue too long.
So what we're saying is if you're having a call and your 3 hours is almost up and you determine they are high risk for suicide, you don't want to leave them. So what do you do in that case, Dennis? Tell our podcast listeners what you do.
Okay, so there are 2 options. And option number 1, which is the one that I've chosen multiple times already, is just to continue and make that 3-hour shift as long as it needs to be, 4 hours or 5 hours, until the contact has de-escalated and has found a safety plan that is appropriate for that contact. Mm-hmm. If you are back-to-back with something else and you have to get off shift, then there's a transfer. You can transfer the chat to another counselor, and there's a protocol within Trevor for doing that. Sometimes we are assigned to be the transfer chat. So oftentimes I am the transfer chat, which means that if somebody else is finishing their shift and has to leave and is in the middle of a high-risk chat, they tell me a little bit about it, and then it's seamless. The transfer is seamless, and we continue on the conversation without the contact really having any break in continuity.
Excellent. Now, that is so loving and courageous on your part to be able to, because we got lives involved here. We got people that are thinking at different levels of taking their life. So it's the most critical thing you can do, give them help. And that's the whole purpose of Trevor, as kids that are struggling with suicide because of that. Do you get calls from people that are transgender too?
Significant number of calls. And so once again, they define themselves as being trans, and some are not surgically changed, but emotionally changed. And, again, they're calling in because they're not getting support in terms of their own journey, and they really need to have some space to talk about what they're going through and what they could think about doing, okay, to keep themselves safe and to also enable them to be their authentic self. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so we move through. There's a wonderful handbook that Trevor has, and it's called the Coming Out Handbook, and I recommend it. I asked some of the contacts, have you seen this handbook? What would you think if I sent it to you? It always has to be the agency of the youth. You don't force anything on the youth. You don't, tell them what to do. It's all relative to their own agency. the Coming Out Handbook, I find to be just an excellent resource, not only for youth, but for their allies as well. And so it's something I ask, and it deals with, it addresses all different aspects of coming out, not just gay, but trans, different feelings, different experiences, what's it like to be your authentic self, provides a lot of guidance as well as a lot of education.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Well, what great work that they're doing and what you're doing as well. We thank you for that, Dennis. Now, when you get to a point where someone you're convinced is probably going to commit suicide, and you gave me an example of one particular case where you had to call and get help for him if he says, I'm just going to kill myself or I'm going to commit suicide. Tell us how you handle that.
Well, first of all, the first thing we do is we contact our supervisor. Okay, so if the risk assessment is imminent risk, we do contact our supervisor, and there's then an option for the supervisor to make a determination whether there needs to be an intervention or whether there needs to have a higher level of consults from a medical professional in the course. So the one thing about Trevor that is wonderful is that it's all evidence-based, okay? It isn't made up. So like we talk about evidence-based medicine, this is evidence-based care, okay? And so what they have psychiatrists and psychologists who have worked on the pathways and the protocols that are utilized by Trevor in order to make certain that there's reliability between and amongst the various different crisis counselors, so that we just don't go off and do our own thing. There is a protocol in place. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you an example, okay, of one contact during the chat. This contact, and we don't know whether they are male, female, or what. We don't ask them to identify, and we typically use the pronouns they or them because we are not certain through the conversation. They can use any name they want. It's the name that we'd like them to have us call them during the course of the chat itself. So we use so this individual, this contact, during the course of the chat, had ingested a significant number of pills with alcohol. And as they were doing it, they were becoming less and less coherent, okay, in the chat. And what I needed to do was to contact my supervisor and let them know what was going on. Okay? And interestingly enough, the contact typed out their address, where they were, including their apartment number. So clearly, this was a call for assistance, a call for help.
Yeah.
And so through that knowledge, the supervisor is the one who contacted the EMS. And, the emergency medical team went over and helped this individual. Now, we don't know what happens as counselors because we're just there in the moment giving the contact space, so we don't maintain a relationship with these individuals as maybe a therapist or a counselor would. These are one conversation at a time during moments of crisis. Mm-hmm. And what I find more often than not is that the youth calling in just need to have space to express themselves. Mm-hmm. Even those who have thoughts of suicide, some suicidal ideation, but don't have a plan, okay, which means that they're probably not suicidal, okay, at that point in time. They think about it, but they don't have a plan, and that's part of the risk assessment. But they need space to express what's going on in their lives. and to de-escalate from the emotions that they're feeling.
Excellent. Wow, what a great work that Trevor Project is doing. I remember when they released their latest survey that mentioned if they had one adult, just one, they can go to and talk to about their issues, that there's 40% less chance of suicide if they just have one adult. And that's overwhelming to me as well. Well, Dennis, you've been such a great guest to have on my podcast today. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thank you for being courageous in your own life story and being courageous to help these kids that are at the point of considering taking their lives. And like you mentioned earlier, we didn't have this in our generation. We didn't have anybody we could go to talk to. We lived in an environment that in our generation that for the most part shamed us for who we are. And shame is one of the most hardest things to deal with in your own life. In fact, I can say the shame in my own case was so great that I did at one time attempt suicide. So I get what that shame's about. And so we really thank you so much for the work you're doing. My hat's off to you and the courage that you've showed in your own life and for the Trevor Project. But as I always ask my podcast guests, what does your life story and the story that you have told through the work you're doing in Trevor, what would your story impact those that are listening to your story? Is there anything you'd like to leave as a last comment about your story and how it may impact other people?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for that question. I would like to leave the story of believing in yourself, being your authentic self, making certain that you stay true to the person you are, and not be cajoled to being somebody who you aren't. And that's really important. The other thing in terms of the story is that we need to move forward as a society, and I think that each one of us has a role to play in that, and recognize that we're good people, we're educated, we have our passions, our love. We deserve to be loved. We deserve respect, and we deserve to be happy.
And I think I'm going to reiterate those things because I put a double star on these when we did the prelude, and Dennis put it so perfectly. You are worthy, you deserve respect, and you deserve love. Those are three critical things that all of us need to embrace in our own life as well. Dennis, if people want to do something to become a counselor with the Trevor Project, is there a website they can go to learn a little bit more about the Trevor Project, and maybe even if they decide hey, I'd really like to be a counselor and they want to go through the training, can you give us the website where they could go?
Sure, it's trevorproject.org. And so just go onto the website, and it's for those who want information, there's a library of information right there on the website itself. And then there's opportunities for getting involved and learning a lot more about the organization, as well as I have to give a pitch for donations. You know, none of us as volunteers get paid, clearly, and there's an army of volunteers out there, but the supervisors are an important and critical element in making Trevor work as well as it does, and the impact. And so, there's no revenue source other than charitable contributions.
Excellent. Thank you, Dennis. Well, you've been such an incredible guest for me today on my podcast. Thank you for the courage in your own life. Thank you for overcoming your own fear through using courage. And thank you for giving our wonderful youth a place that they can come and they can come and be authentic to themselves and the gift you're giving them by, in many cases, Dennis, you're saving lives. And I thank you. My hat's off to you. And thank you for doing the podcast with me today.
Thank you, Dan.
You take care. Bye-bye now.